Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our podcast titled Azadi and Identity, the Muslim Struggle for 1947. In the context of Bangladesh, the discussion around 1947 has been a taboo topic due to various ideological, political, and historical factors. And we see it still very strong even after the July Revolution. So today, like this month, as we celebrate the first year of the July Revolution in Bangladesh, we also need to explore some other critical moments of our history, as 1947 is a very significant moment in the history of South Asia. And not only that, if we can connect it to broadly to the Muslim world as well. So to discuss these issues today, we have three scholars with us. I will introduce each of them very briefly as we start with them one by one. So we'll first go with Professor Sherali Tarin. He's a professor of religious studies at Franklin and Marshall College in the US. He's also the author of the award-winning books Defending Muhammad in Modernity, 2020, and Perilous Intimacies, Debating the Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire, 2023. He's also working on his third book, An Intellectual History and Biography of the Preeminent 18th Century Scholar Shah Waliullah. So, Dr. Tarin, I will start with you. What's your reading and understanding of the vision of a Muslim state in 1947 among the ulama and the Muslim intellectuals at that time? Because normally we are not used to focus on what the ulama contributed to the creation of 1947. So your thoughts on that?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, though, for organizing this gathering, and I'm really honored to be in the presence of really amazing scholars, Salman and Tanzeen. It's always a true treat to be in conversation with them. And, I want to begin, first of all, by paying my tribute and with the prayer and celebration of the martyrs of the July Revolution, who stood up against a liberal, secular, fundamentalist political order successfully. So I just want to begin with that tribute. And to come to your question, so let me be very concise, because we have some very esteemed panelists on this panel here. So before I come to the ulama, I think it might be useful to take a step back and think a bit about the very kind of what Salman oftentimes very rightly calls an Indological historiography around the question of partition, around the question of Pakistan and South Asia more broadly speaking, whereby there is a certain attempt to present a narrative of the past which has been refracted through a liberal secular prism. And one way to make it much more concrete, let's just make it very concrete by looking at this debate on the whole question of Pakistan, whereby, I think one text that would be very useful for us to use as a point of departure is the 2014 book by Venkat Dhulipala, Creating a New Medina, which coincidentally, actually, I just saw in my office is right here. This book, which was incredibly controversial and had different kind of readings and misreadings. And one of the things that Dhulipala tried to do in that book, and I think it's very useful to think with him, even if one disagreed with any of his arguments, but I think something really important of an intervention that he made was that he tried to disrupt this idea of Pakistan as some kind of a historical accident, as this completely vague idea that some elite political leaders ushered South Asia into without any kind of thought or argument or debates or conceptualization, that this was some kind of a complete kind of a helter-skelter moment where nobody knew what was happening. There was this elite bargaining of power among the British and the Indian National Congress and the elite of the Muslim League. And from that kind of complete disarray and unpredictability of what might have happened, this new nation state all of a sudden came into being on 14th August without anyone knowing what it really is or what it represents. So this kind of a narrative, which has been a major consensus of the historiography, which really is the orthodoxy in terms of how we think about this past in Western historiography, but even with many circles in the South Asian political and liberal cultural elite, and even the intellectual elite for that matter, this kind of a notion. And Dhulipala really disrupts that notion, which really was most popularized by the historian Aisha Jalal in her otherwise, quite well-documented book, The Sole Spokesperson or Sole Spokesman, I forget exact title, 1985 volume on Jinnah. More recently, she's been writing about Muslim scholars and has been writing rather horrendously, I may add, Her more recent book is called The Enlightened Muslim, and it's just the most bizarre description online. Even the abstract is just ridiculous. Anyways, I won't go there now. But Dhulepala disrupted this whole narrative of Pakistan as some kind of a completely inchoate ideological entity by showing that, in fact, there is a long running, in the decade leading up to the partition, tradition of debates, arguments, contestations, notions of what an Islamic political formation might look like, in which you have multiple actors with their own contributions. You have political actors within the ulama. Now I'm coming to your crux of your question. Within the ulama, there are competing viewpoints. Among the Deobandis, there are competing viewpoints of how they're imagining this. And I think even if you might critique him for his use of particular, discourses of Maulana Shabir Ahmad Usmani, who becomes his main kind of protagonist, although he does also spend some time thinking about someone as prominent as Ashraf Ali Thanvi, the great Deoband scholar who died 1944, who was very opposed to, other people in the Deoband school like Hussain Ahmad Madani, who argued for this idea of the composite nationalism, where Madani's main argument, put it very briefly, is that Hindu-Muslim political solidarity does have a precedent in the Islamic tradition, and he cited the Pact of Medina as being a precedent for that, between Jews and Muslims during the Prophet's time, as being a precedent that can be employed by Indian Muslims at that time to forge this kind of composite nationalism. And Ashraf Ali Thanvi and others from within the Deoband school again really critiqued him for that idea and proposed a different kind of a conception of the Islamic political formation. So within the same school, it's a major school, but still it is this, part of the ulama kind of worldview. You have these traditions of debate and competing viewpoints. But the main point that I want to, as a take-home point from your question, is that there is not, the evidence is really preponderant that there is a political theological conception of a political formation called Pakistan. Now, it might have its ambiguities, its contradictions, and so on, that we can get into. But nonetheless, this is a part of a long-running, well-discoursed, reasoned, argued over notion of an Islamic political formation. And you cannot erase that history. You cannot erase that preponderant evidence by just pointing to these liberal secular narratives of, oh, this was completely this was just an instrumentalization of Islam as a discourse, and no one knew what was happening, and in came this new nation state that just came into being out of nowhere. So we really need to, in answering your question, we need to be very alert to these secular, Indological, theoretical frameworks through which we access the past and ask the questions that we ask. And when we do that, we will look at these different actors like Shabir Ahmad Usmani, Ashraf Ali Thanvi, and other non-ulama actors as well, who are clearly presenting a notion of an Islamic political formation, which is well-reasoned discourse.
Thank you for your input. I saw a hand raised. Oh, no. So I will now go back to Dr. Tanzin Doha. He's a visiting assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he specializes in Islamism, secularism, and race. He basically engages with 20th century Islamist thought in the context of post 9/11 security regimes. His first book project is about the Deobandi practitioners who kind of were the victims of the 2013 Shapla massacre in Dhaka, Bangladesh. He also has an ethnographic project about the Rohingya Muhajir and the Deobandi Ansar in the aftermath of the Rohingya crisis in 2016-17. So for Dr. Doha, I have this question. Since you specialize in the history of Islamism, anti-Islamism, and modernity, secularity in the 20th century, how do you assess the Muslim political project in 1947?
Thank you for that question. Assalamu alaikum. This is a great honor to be here with Dr. Salman Saeed and Dr. Shirley Tareen. I want to begin also by remembering the Martyrs of July, which created a new landscape in Bangladesh, in which we're allowed to think about 47 in a way where we can explode the secular historiography that was established by the Bengali nationalists by anchoring everything from 71, and that too a very, very simplistic understanding of 71. And the Hasina regime, the war on terror regime, the secular necropolitical regime that was dismissed and negated through this struggle was also conducted, I would say operationally and logistically, by those who are in different ways connected to the question of Islam and connected to Islamist politics in various ways, even though this is a heterogeneous struggle. So I'm quite sure about that. But it is very important to recognize who conducted the uprisings. And we should not feel shy about that. There is a tendency in Bangladeshi speakers to kind of negotiate with secular narration in a way to always deny ourselves and what we've done. So that is the first point. The second point is the question of Pakistan, and particularly 1947. I will talk more concretely about some of the importance and significance of Pakistan as a state, but as an idea, as a concept, as a movement, it is the most important concept for Muslims to have emerged in the history of South Asia. I have no doubt about that, and I think anyone serious about Islamism and the attack on Islamism, which is anti-Islamism, how I frame it, is we should understand the significance of Pakistan without reducing it to the question of a nation state. So the 1947 is important because this is where we're seeing and noticing, and here I'm indebted to some of the arguments made by a very good friend of mine. His name is Tariqul Huda, who wrote in an article published in Milestones, which was published somewhere else first. It was on sovereignty, in which he talked about the debates between Mohammed Assad and Talal Assad, and he kind of suggested that there has to be actually a rethinking of Mohammed Assad and not a dismissing of Mohammed Assad in a straightforward way to rethink the question of Pakistan. And so one of the things that 47 makes very clear is at the level of constitution, it forces the secularism to delimit its grasp on sovereignty. The fact that Allah's sovereignty is right there is a massive achievement. It's not just a textual sort of fetishistic thing about the constitution or some paperwork. It is the fact that Muslims began to understand that they have to create a particular form that antagonizes the straightforward notion of a secular republic. And I think this is so that kind of construction of a constitution, of a political legal structure, of a modern struggle in which the modern state is questioned to have its sort of standard form and to deal with Islam centrally. So Pakistan is the name in which Muslims of South Asia, against Indian domination, have created a space, social historical space, in which they began to think constitutionally, which means politically, about what their future and what their present is going to look like. And of course, I agree with Sherali, and I love his work so much. There is so much complexity in those debates and how to form this and what would it amount to. But those debates are what created this possibility. And I think for us in Bangladesh, there has to be now a reopening of the 47 question. And history doesn't work this way, where you have this kind of right Hegelian tendency of just moving forward and leaving everything behind. And we're kind of looking for this telos. And for some reason in modernity, it ends up being secularism is what needs to be achieved. And 47 was just a stepping stone for that. And I think history is always something that explodes itself. And we can look at 47 in a way where it is forever kind of the inspiration of Muslims of South Asia. And there are other things I could say, and I'm sure, Thoha, you're going to ask other questions in which I can respond to that. But I would say that in two different contexts, Iran, the Islamic Revolution of Iran, and the formation of Pakistan are the two events that are, structurally speaking, in 20th century, what stood up at the level of state as an achievement, a political achievement that needs to be an ongoing kind of engagement and negotiation for those who are serious about politics.
Thank you, Dr. Doha. You have touched on like certain points regarding constitution and also the problematics around the idea of Pakistan in Bangladesh after 1971, and I will come back to you with those issues at later some point. But now I will go back to Dr. Salman Saeed. He's a professor of social theory and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds. He specializes in decolonial thought, post-structuralist political theory, and critical Muslim studies. He has some noted publications, The Fundamental Fear and Recalling the Caliphate. So, Dr. Said, you have written an article, I think I have also said that last time in our panel discussion, The Meaning of Pakistan, and we have translated it into Bangla on our website, shantaram.com. So, in the light of that kind of writing, like how do you explain the historical significance of 1947 to you?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and I would like to again say the du'as for the martyrs of the July Revolution. I think it's really, really important to understand what they managed to achieve by removing one of the most entrenched communist regimes, and makes these conversations like this even possible. So I think it's really important to recognize that. But I will also point out that, we are talking about a few days after 14th of August, which of course was supposed to be Independence Day for Pakistan. And while there may not be anything to cheer about that, and whether Pakistan has, or any bits of it have, because at least the eastern part of that project seems to be far more, has managed to achieve a certain kind of independence, and perhaps the western part should have followed the example of the eastern part in dealing with that. It may have been a different kind of configuration. So I think it's something that we should think about together about these things, and the sacrifices that were made in 47 to actually allow this ensemble to take place. I agree with Tanzeen and Shirley that I do think that the formation and emergence of the idea of Pakistan and its implementation in something more than just a kind of fantasy of people writing ideal constitutions and imagining, imaginary worlds, etc., is really, really important and significant. Where I would perhaps slightly disagree with both of them, and only with great trepidation, because I admire them both very much, and I hope they will forgive this impertinence, is in the way that they would only want to relate this to the question of South Asia. And they want to say that this is a great development of South Asia. I would say, brothers, and hopefully there are sisters here, I would say sisters as well, be bolder. I would say that it is one of the most significant, potentially one of the most significant events, as you said before, in the history of Muslimstan itself and the Ummah. And the reason I would say this is twofold. This is not just some kind of gleeful kind of playing of what could be the greater. One of the things is that we are trying to talk about something to do with Pakistan, an attempt to create a modern state, which was not a nation state in the same time as there was a state. We wanted to be a state. This is, I think, the kind of template is important. So on the one hand, we understand the formation and the whole 1947 as a struggle against colonialism, and that's quite straightforward. And I think both Shirley and Tanzim have said that, there's a lot of ink that has been split about the struggle of colonialism and how it was negotiated and calibrated in different ways. But the other thing I think about Pakistan is also an interesting achievement, is that it's a struggle against Kemalism. And that is both its potentiality and I think its tragedy in a sense. Because if you think about the enshrinement of Kemalism, and here, if you take 1924 as the abolition of the caliphate as a symbolic beginning of Kemalism, and we could debate where it goes before, and then you think that in that first decade, think as what's happening in what was by all accounts, the strongest Muslim political community that was still independent, which had fought the Western allies to a standstill up till about 1917, was the last army of the Axis to actually surrender in 1919, which had done all of that, was completely transformed, which had not been colonized, managed to colonize itself in the space of a decade. If you look at many of the reforms that take place. So when Pakistan comes into being, it's almost coming into being in a terrain where it is almost unthinkable to imagine a Muslim political subjectivity except as some kind of lost, nostalgic, romantic assertion. And the idea of being able to create and to articulate a Muslim political subjectivity, I think, is a major, major undertaking. And here I would kind of reflect a little bit on the name of Pakistan, which I do in the article as well. It's a very odd thing. Everyone who talks about Pakistan is so determined to put it in its South Asian box. And that includes many of the people who were thinking about Pakistan. But Pakistan has no reference to any particular lands. It's not, it is not linked to a particular territory. And this is one of the reasons why it is possible to have Pakistan both in the East and the West. And according to Hindutva activists, everywhere there's a Muslim community in India is a little Pakistan. You could have had what is now Burma as parts of Burma as part of Pakistan. You could have had parts of what the Arabian Gulf as part of Pakistan. And the idea in Pakistan is what it creates is a space for Muslim political subjectivity, which is not unified by language, which is not unified by any kind of notion of ethnicity, which creates something very, very different. And the final point about this I want to make is that you often get, and I think, I share the disquiet about the ideological discourse around partition and the formation of Pakistan. And one of the things you often hear so quickly is, well, the reason why Pakistan has lacked legitimacy is the people who advocated for it in UP, for example, were never going to be able to be part of it. Therefore, it just shows there's some sort of mismatch. There's a mismatch between the creation of this land under these difficult challenges and those who were advocating for it. And this is somehow supposed to say, well, this can't be serious. I think it shows the absolute opposite of that. And if these people ever read Gramsci or anything to do with politics, they would realize what it shows is that the people who were not even going to be part of that settlement or that territory, eventually how it emerged, they still advocated for it because for them it was a principle, which is basically the hallmark of something being political. It wasn't just simple, narrow self-interest. And whenever you see that kind of ability to transcend that narrow sectional interest, you are in the terrain of the political, which reinforces that the idea of the Pakistan was a political idea for a space for Muslim subjectivity, which was not bound by the dominance of contours around a kind of imitation or a coercive understanding of a West-toxicated landscape of how political communities need to be formed. So in that sense, from the very beginning, it's an experiment. And some of the experimental part of it is, I would argue, is perhaps more intuitive than we would have thought. But there's an interest. Why is it that the name, they take the name Pakistan? They don't call themselves India. Or they could have taken many names. But the name of Pakistan itself is yes, everyone says, oh, well, it shows that it has no space. It is a new creation. It is, and that's the idea of a new creation uproots the notions of the idea of the nation being already there and just winning its political rights. In a way, what you have in Pakistan is a project that is bringing something new into the world, rather than something which is just simply a recovery of what has been lost. And that is both its challenges and its tragedies and the difficulties around that, which we can discuss. But I think it's very, very important to remember that the task of making Pakistan was incredibly difficult, not simply empirically because of the resources available, but intellectually. It was the first attempt to think through beyond Kemalism, beyond the kind of Eurocentric discourse of nationhood and ethno-nationalism, and to think about a future in which Muslimness had a part to play other than simply at the level of some kind of exotic thing that you celebrate on high holidays, etc.
Thank you. I will now start with Dr. Shirley Tarin again. And there is another kind of debate on the side of course, the nationalist people. I mean, they try to question the viability of the project of Pakistan, but also on the side of Islamists, there is a debate going on all the time that okay, Pakistan was a project of Muslim nationalism, and by that they want to kind of downplay the Islamicity of that project. And where do you place yourself in that debate?
So, as a point of departure in addressing your question, Toha, I think the last point that Salman mentioned and Tanzeen also alluded to it is the question of an aspirational understanding of the political, right? So, even when it comes to the caliphate, for example, in all its classical or other formations, the caliphate has always been an aspirational concept. There is no such thing as the perfect caliphate that has actually been implemented, but it's an aspiration towards a political formation that provides the conditions for establishing proximity between the human and the divine and a certain moral order that would help with that. So I think that's one thing that should be really punctuated. Secondly, the Islamic discourses around the question of Pakistan, coming from the ulama, Sufi peers, other sort of constituencies, or from non-religious elite as well. And the Islamic political discourses, even predating 1935, say in the 1920s, 10s, late 19th century, which are also talking about the question of the political in different ways, with the Khilafat movement, or for that matter, those who were opposed to the Khilafat movement. There are a whole motley of scholars. It is really important to punctuate the point that these Muslim intellectual discourses on the political were not replicating the logic of modern state sovereignty, whereby the modern state establishes its sovereignty through the regulation of public order, or in the name of public order, through the regulation of law. I mean, that in some ways is the underlying kind of linchpin of modern state sovereignty, and what in some ways distinguishes it from other political formations, that it in some ways it establishes and maintains and entertains the fantasy of its own sovereignty through this notion of public order that it regulates via the law, which will always privilege majoritarian sensibilities, majoritarian priorities, which is, of course, an argument has been made in different ways by different scholars, of course, by Sabah Mahmood in the context of Egypt, Religious Difference in a Secular Age, her second and outstanding book. So it is very important to realize that these Islamic political discourses that we're talking about, even when they disagree with each other on what the political should constitute, they are not relying on this notion of a modern state sovereignty. And regardless of what happened with them, or who won out, who lost, and it's a bit, conceptually problematic to even get into that game of who won and who lost. But even if one were to entertain that sport, that conceptually wanting sport, it is very important to always highlight that their readings of the Islamic tradition are not operating on the secular logic of the management of difference in the public sphere between ethnic majorities and minorities, religious majorities and minorities, whereby when a certain situation emerges, when the public order is disturbed, in comes the modern state, establishes its sovereignty, often through brute force, through institutions like the police and the army and so on, via the regulation of the law. And it always almost does that through the invocation of public order, which is, of course, also a colonial legacy which continues in different South Asian contexts even today. So that's the first thing I really want to highlight. And the second thing to really highlight is that, your question is, to what extent was this really a theological project? To what extent was really this thought out? And the clear answer is that, and the precise answer is that it is a theological project. It is a project where you have Muslim scholars, elite and non-elite, debating the question of how do we establish a political order that reconfirms and affirms divine sovereignty and divine law. They have different recipes on that question. They have different solutions to that. They have different aspirational blueprints to how one must achieve that. But that theological imperative is driving and is very coherent and is very clear and explicit in the discourses that you find before the 1930s and even into the 30s and leading into the 40s. Now, if you don't want to entertain those discourses, and if you want to sideline them, and if you want to just ignore them, that's your choice. But that desire to de-theologize Pakistan as an aspirational concept, or any Islamic political order, is a thorough secular desire which pervades the academy. And one of the reasons why, a book like Venkat Dhulipala's created such anxiety and such discomfort was that in some ways he was disrupting this de-theologized understanding of Pakistan and of Jinnah. Right? That is the underlying anxiety here, that don't take the secular Pakistan, the secular teleology, the secular Jinnah away from us. Because if you take that away from us, what will we have left? So, and we really need to get to these, the what I would call the alliance of the Lahore and the Karachi Gymkhana and the Bombay and the Delhi Gymkhanas, this elite sort of, left and scholars who, pervade the academy and basically pervade elite institutions within South Asia and then also the Western Academy. We always need to, through evidence, through careful readings of the archive and the tradition, come back at and really puncture the underlying secular anxieties that drive these kinds of, readings of the past, which in some ways ignore or whitewash the evidence that is there.
So we are like kind of discussing for half an hour, and I think Dr. Doha and I are in trouble already because we will be termed as Rajakar, which is like the collaborator of Pakistani armies in 1971, because we have been discussing the idea of Pakistan in a very positive sense. So that will be my question now. Like, how do you see, Dr. Doha, how the understanding of Pakistan has been reframed in the post 1971 Bangladesh? And what does it mean today for Bangladesh in the post-July uprising moment?
Yeah, I'm so glad Shirley brought up the question of de-theologization. That is the way that the Bangladeshi state was sort of established in 71 and through the 72 constitution. Some of the good secularists, so we call them good secularists because these are the secularists who basically, and not through violence. We say the vulgar secularists want to hang us and the good secularists want to discipline us by training us about the significance of what Assad would call the transcendent mediation of secularism. So the idea that secularism is the only thing that can resolve problems of difference. And so the real political power of Islamism is that Islamism is not playing this contingency games. It wants to take away that specific power that secularism wants to have, which is it wants to be the mediator of difference. It wants to assert itself as this is the only way we can treat you and deal with you through a political, legal, structural framework. And that is what is being questioned when we're thinking about even the question of, let's say, the category of the Rajakar, which is the enemy of the Bangladeshi narrative. And I think in 71 we have a interest to think about a state that basically transitions out of the Pakistan project and wants to establish a basic sort of liberal republic. And then in 72, there is a more stated assertive notion of secularism as a doctrine, but it is already there in 71, according to the historiography that we have, right? Where they're saying the values of equality, human rights, etc., and human dignity, which are basically the precise values that come out of the secular domain. And they wanted to change the language of secularism and just called it insaf and use an Islamic word, but internally the substance of it is the same as secularism. So that's how the leftists have tried to be good seculars, by saying, oh no, we're going to have conversations on Islam. This is Islam, but ultimately when we're looking at it, the content does not have the real questioning of secular power, which the idea of Pakistan had. And so Rajakar is a very interesting concept after July, because the July, in quotations, revolution, because it's not a full-on revolution, it's an uprising, happened with that first sentence, Ami ke, tumi ke, Rajakar, Rajakar. Who are you? Who am I? These were the students were saying. We are Rajakars, we are Rajakars. And so this was how this whole thing started. So this idea of Rajakarness, the enemy of the Bengali nationalists, of Bengali secularism, asserting themselves within the public domain and actually getting rid of Sheikh Hasina, the regime that was completely organized around principles of war on terror, which is war on Islam, is a tremendous kind of rearticulation of thinking about the crisis of 71 and thinking about the possibility of 47. So I think, Thoha, that's how I look at it. And And we have to think about this notion of Razakarness. What is that for us? That the name actually interrupts the flow, the smooth operation of secular power in Bangladeshi politics. So that is the way I look at it, and I think I kind of want to make sure that we also, the other thing is, I'm remembering now, there are many sort of leftist and Marxist thinkers who are always looking at, the ones who are the good secularists, so to speak, who want to think of 47 in a kind of semi-positive way. They look at it as a transition phase that anticipates 71. It's like, oh, we needed 47. Of course, we credit 47. This is how we got out of Indian Hindu domination. But then the West Pakistani domination, we had to get out of that and create the real republic in 71. So without 47, we wouldn't have 71. So there's this idea of a linear chronological historiography, always reaching and finalizing itself with the secular state. And wow, that's the achievement. So this was the 47 for them, was this interruption and kind of a necessary interruption to arrive at secularity. And I think this is a major kind of a problem of reading political history for us who are thinking about the question of Pakistan from the eastern side. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Dr. Said, as Dr. Doha has touched on the historiographic aspects, how do you locate all the kind of problematics around the idea of Pakistan or 47 in the current historiography, especially at a time when the idea is that Pakistan is a failed state and we shouldn't kind of incorporate those problems, those crises of Pakistan in the current Bangladesh after 1971 by kind of articulating same kind of sovereignty, same kind of notion of a Muslim state. So that's why we need to be a proper secular state to avoid those crises that Pakistan are in at the moment. So yeah, your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's ironic the way that secularity is mobilized in relation to Muslimness in so many different contexts. So I guess the first thing would be to argue two things. One is the distinction that secularity makes is not necessarily a distinction that resonates in the same way within Islamicate contexts. And the simplest way of putting it, the kind of secularity that comes from a liberal understanding also is the kind of secularity that completely whitewashes liberalism to get to that point. So one of the things that, for example, we know that liberalism was compatible with racism, it was compatible with imperialism, and it was compatible with colonialism. In which case, the idea of liberalism as being an answer to every single problem that is becomes much more complicated, right? So that's the first issue. Now, it would be a foolish person to say, well, surely what has happened in Pakistan demonstrates the failure of the Pakistan project. Yeah, and this is, of course, a two-nation theory. And one of the issues is that we've constantly had this notion of the failure of the two-nation theory. But part of it, and I think as both Tanzeen and Shirley have said, is the conception or the understanding of the two-nation theory that circulates, imagines the nation to be simply an ethno-nationalist project along the lines of what you would find in a particular secularist, liberal, Eurocentric reading of its own history. Now, one of the issues is this. So take, for example, explain to me this. If the argument is that the only legitimate political community is one which is based around some kind of ethno-nationalism, then the examples that you see everywhere is that wherever you've seen ethno-nationalism entrenched, you've actually seen genocide. Explicitly. I'll give you another example just to illustrate this point. What is now England and what is now Iraq have more or less been respectively under Christian rule and Muslim rule for about roughly the same 1400 years, 1200 years, something like that. It's just around that, right? We know this sort of case. How many non-Christian communities are there in England? Viable non-Christian communities in England. They got rid of the Jews in the 13th century, they expelled them. All the other non-Christian communities come in the wake of the 19th and mainly the mid-20th century as migration from imploding empires. The first mosque that you have is somewhere around 1880s. Similarly, the first Gurdwara, just to talk about the South Asian here, I'm being ideological just to help everyone along, is around about the beginning of the 20th century. Similarly, the first Hindu temple as a marker is somewhere a bit later than that, in the 1920s, 1930s, something like that, right? So now, if you compare this with Iraq, we know that there have been viable and self-sustaining pre-Islamic communities which have existed even to this day, even to the horrors of Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein was a secularist, even when he put Allah Akbar on the flag. He was someone who believed in ethno-nationalism. This is why he was involved in projects of ethnic cleansing against the Kurds and many others. So, and if you accept that the project of the deterioration in the relationship between East and West, in the case of Pakistan, surely it was not an enactment of anything to do with the logic of Muslimness, but rather an attempt to create ethnic nationalist homogeneity. And you can see that over the question of language. You could see that over the question about the internalization of the racism of martial races into the military and many other ways. So what you have is not that Pakistan has failed. It is what I always say, that those who've believed in Pakistan have never been able to have been in a position to implement it. And those who never believed in it have always ruled it. So that's one of the issues that I would say. And the final point I would say is this, that surely if the two-nation theory had failed completely, why is it that in 1971, Bangladesh doesn't join the rest of Bengal? In the end, the construction of a Bangla nationality which is infused with Muslimness. First, we know the history of that, who didn't want the Muslim Bengalis there, even though they were Bengalis. But a real failure of 71 would have been a unification in some kind of federation or even in the Indian Union. And surely that's what the Indian nationalists would have meant. So why has that never been a serious proposition? So in the sense that I think sometimes we get ourselves tangled up in looking at these terms, is that they have a meaning that is cultivated with ideological discourse and not working out how their logic really plays out very, very differently. So I have no illusions about the myriad disappointments, failures, etc., of what is, if you want, West Pakistan, or if you want West Bangladesh. I mean, it doesn't really matter at that point there. But I also know that the idea or the aspirational notion of having a political community based on Muslimness rather than ethno-nationalism has a transformational and a emancipatory potential that intuitively is grasped with great tenacity. And you have to tell me this, that given that Bangladesh's economic growth in the last 20 years or whatever, given that you had this entrenched regime, why is it that you did not see the abandonment of Muslimness in the face of this effective and efficient Kemalism? Or similarly, you can make the same argument in Turkey. So these questions need to be brought into the table if you're going to have a serious conversation. And they never are. It's simply assumed that we know why it failed. It failed because it did this wrong. And what I would say to you, at least I hope I can suggest, that perhaps the failure is that it never actually delivered on what it wanted as aspirational template that it could have done. And if you look at, for example, in the mid-50s, when Pakistan changes its citizenship laws, making it almost impossible for Muslims, even from the rest of South Asia, to become citizens. Now that's where the rot starts in a way. And that, I think, has got very little to do with secularity or politically. It's not to do with the Pakistan is a religious state compared to all the secular states. Like, for example, India is supposed to be a secular state, and we can argue about that. And I hope we will argue about that. I just don't see it. So perhaps I'm missing something.
I will ask one last question to Dr. Tareen, and to our audience. Dr. Sharil Tareen has to leave a bit early, so if you have any specific question to him, you can ask in the chat now. But yeah, the last question. So, as Dr. Salman said, was pointing out that there are these questions around the viability of the Pakistan project. How do you see the viability of the project of a Muslim state, especially in an age of hyper-liberalism and secularism? And there are understanding within also the Muslim circles that, okay, these are the ideas of old generation and the old Islamic scholars and thinkers. Now we have moved forward. We are now more integrated to the global system. And even within Bangladesh, we are now talking within the Islamic circles and beyond. We are talking basically about the idea of welfare state. So, as an intellectual historian, how do you evaluate the idea of Muslimness in a political project in 21st century?
The first thing I would say is that, this question of viability, oftentimes there are much higher standards which are applied to the question of viability when it comes to Islamic political formations versus the viability of liberalism, right? So, yes, it is a very difficult intellectual and political project to think about the question of the role of Islam and Muslimness with the structuration of the modern state and modern state sovereignty. And how does the question of Islam and Muslimness engage with the underlying aporias, the underlying irresolvable contradictions of the modern nation state and the way in which it manages its sovereignty? That's a very difficult question. And on that, there is an interesting debate to be had, in fact, between, for example, Talal Asad and his own father, whereby Talal Asad, so far as I've read him, is quite suspicious of the capacity of any modern nation state to overcome these irresolvable contradictions, even if it calls itself an Islamic nation state and so on. So I think that's a very interesting debate to be had. But I just want to quickly flag this question of viability. In that, one thing we know is that liberalism and liberal secularism is not viable. And if there is anything that this genocide has taught us, it is that this is the quintessential example of a liberal secular order which is, sustained through brute violence, through the most horrific kind of immoral violence that we have seen in the recent or not so recent past. So one thing is for certain, this is not viable, the world order we are in right now. Then we can think about the viability of other conceptions of the political, in which Islam and Muslimness have an important role to play. So that's the first thing. Second point I want to make is that this question that we've been talking about, in some ways, it's extremely important to engage with aspects of the Islamic tradition, Islamic political thought, Muslim political thinkers, from Ali Shariati to Maududi to other ulama and so on. The reason why these thinkers and their thought and the resources they provide are so important is that they might enable us, or they might provide us with some possibility of keeping our imagination open to the idea that the modern nation state and its own narrative that it tells about itself is inevitable. To keep that inevitability in doubt, engaging these resources are important, and keeping one's imagination open to that is important. So that's point number two. The third point I want to make is that, you talked before the last question that this has become some kind of we're doing a positive reading of Pakistan. And I would just, not correct you, but say that in some ways what we're doing is analytical thinking. So this is the kind of way in which it would be presented that, oh, this was some kind of a Pakistan fest, which would be incredibly ironic given the current state of Pakistan that we have right now. But that's not what we're doing. We are engaged in an analytic question and exercise of how do we think about the political. And it should not be seen as positive or negative and so on. But that opens up the question of, can there be a critique of Pakistan, of the Pakistani nation state, the contemporary nation state especially, which does not rely on secular Indological logics? Can we in fact do critique the Pakistani military today, for example, which in all measure is a thuggish military being led currently by an absolutely immoral, un-Islamic, terrorist, brutal thug called General Asim Munir, and the institution that he represents.
Field Marshal.
Exactly. Kamalist also, who literally now is licking, the U.S. state, which the military has done very successfully for many decades, but this person has taken it to a different level. But can we critique the Pakistani state, the military, and its violence in ways that do not rely on this kind of a bifurcation between, oh, look, secular India and Islamic Pakistan? This thoroughly Islamophobic, liberal, secular kind of narrative, which is parroted not only by the Indian media or cultural critics, but even by many academics. That's the underlying kind of framework that they have. Oh, let not, Modi is so bad because Modi is turning India into a Pakistan. As if the Congress was some really heavenly kind of, angelic figures in different parts of India in terms of their relationship to Islam and what they've done in Kashmir. So we always need to, frame one's critique in a manner which does not rely on these kinds of ideological secular logics. And on Kashmir, so point number 4, I think that in some ways also is a key arena that has to be brought into our conversation, because your question that you asked in some ways is, so what is to be done? Where does one get some aspiration for? And clearly, I think the example of Bangladesh currently in the among the 3 nation states of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that's where I think is the most hope for some aspiration towards a political formation can be seen. But the other hope that I really see is in the theater of Kashmir, that again, like Palestine, is this paradigmatic theater of the violence of secular power. This is how it justifies its violence, that if we do not engage in violence, if we do not regulate these populations, they will turn to Islam, they will become radicalized, and their Islam will spill into violence, right? This underlying secular logic. So, for example, when it comes to something like Pahalgam, fine, we all can, mourn the loss of human life, but why do we not raise the question of, what the hell were these tourists doing in the first place at a settler colonial site? Do other Kashmiris have that kind of a possibility of going bungee jumping and zip lining and so on? What were they thinking? I'm not justifying the violence there, but one has to think about these questions of before coming out with condemnations of these innocent tourists were hurt. And finally, I think we need to think, Toha, and on the question of violence. So the fundamental secular assumption in some ways is this bifurcation between the political and violence. That when the nation state engages in violence, whether that is Israel or India or the current Pakistani nation state, for example, it is doing it through rationality and rationalism, and it has some kind of logic behind it. But when non-nation state actors do it, that violence is condemnable, that can turn into religion and so on. See, this underlying bifurcation between religion is equal to fanatic, is equal to violent, the state is equal to politics, is equal to rational, is equal to reasoned. This underlying bifurcation of violence and politics is something that we need to undermine, and we need to be very clear about and think about questions of what is the political work being done by an entity like Hamas? What is the political work being done by resistance fighters in places like Kashmir? At the risk of being labeled as Islamic fundamentalists, etc. Again, from a position of analytical thought, not from some position of identitarian politics and so on, but through the position of analysis. Why do we make this bifurcation between violence and politics when, and that's the final thing I will say, when empirically the most prolific producer of violence in the contemporary world is the American nation state, and after that would be Israel. These liberal nation states are the most prolific perpetrators of terroristic violence. So why do we give a different category to Islamist or Islamic terrorism versus the terrorism of these nation states? So that underlying secular logic, I think, needs to be disrupted. And that's where these resources from the Islamic tradition, from Islamic political thought, can be extremely useful for that kind of a project and critique of the secular.
Thank you, Dr. Tarin. And I will ask the same question about the viability in relation to liberalism and secularism, and what does it mean to discuss about 1947 today for Bangladesh, for South Asia, and broadly the Muslim world. But before that, as Dr. Sharil Tarin will leave, I think within
I want to hear if I leave, I'll silently leave, but I can do till 12.
No, but we have one question for you.
No, let's complete the discussion. I'll come to, if there was time, I'll come to that.
Okay. Thank you. So Dr. Toha, yeah, you can continue.
Did you have a question for me, Toha?
Yeah, so I was saying that I have the same question to you, both of you, like Dr. Doha and Dr. Salman said, on the question of the viability as opposed to the liberalism and the secularism, and what does it mean to discuss about 1947 for today's Bangladesh, today's South Asia, and today's Muslim world, as I asked Dr. Sherali Terin.
Can I just pick up from where Sherali left off? Because I think it's something that I wanted to say, and to build on what he said. Hopefully, I build on what he said. I think one of the biggest problems is this, that liberal secular narratives, I would put it more strongly, they actually do deny the violence of liberalism. It's not just that they kind of, it's not an episodic thing. Because for them, because liberalism assumes that it is basically rational, anyone who opposes is irrational. If you're irrational, you're not quite human, and if you're not quite human, violence doesn't have any currency against you. It doesn't really matter in the same way. So I think this is one of the most important points to make. Linked to that is when we talk about, again, the question about viability, and I think it's really, really important. What do we mean by the selective way in which we decide what is viable and what is not viable? What are we kind of judging here? So every kind of instance of mass violence that we see, whether it be the ongoing genocide now, whether it be the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, or what's happening to the Uyghurs, or what's happening in Kashmir, for example, all of these things, the narrative around them is very, very straightforward. All of these are joined in that we need to quash this Muslimness because it poses a threat to the viability of order in these societies, or the possibility of these societies having a future. That's the narrative around it. Yeah. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that why is it that the most of the xenophobic forces in the planet right now see their enemy in the shape of Muslimness? If you want to believe in a homogenous nation, and whether you are, and this is where I think the Kemalists come in as well, everyone who dreams about a homogenous nation, homogenous ethno-nation, wants to expel Muslimness. Now, one could argue that this is an empirical thing, but I would say to you, why is it that Muslimness becomes a marker or the grist that prevents the enclosure of the ethno-homogeneous nation? Because ultimately, in all of its problematic instances, Muslimness still manages to transcend enclosure within ethno-nationalism. Now, when I say this, or anyone says this, people will put out these examples, but what about this Muslim country or that Muslim country? But look at the way that Muslim country represents itself. But if you look at, for example, why is it, and I ask this question again and again, in July, in the demonstrations that overthrew Hasina, I saw pictures of the Bangladeshi flag, which seems normal, but I also saw pictures of the Palestinian flag. Why? What has Palestine got to do with what's happening in Bangladesh? On the one hand, there's nothing. On the other, everything. I was in a demonstration, pro-Palestinian demonstration yesterday or the day before, and there was a counter demonstration, and there was a kind of vexillological chain of equivalence. This person had the flag of Tel Aviv, the flag of India, the flag of the Shah of Iran, and the UK flag. So basically, these four countries become a marker of what is common to them. Their institutionalized idea that the Muslimness has to be crushed. So when we talk about the viability of the liberal state, let's not kid ourselves that one of the things that frightens the so-called liberal state and which can never deal with is the fact that Muslimness cannot be contained within successfully within any ethno-nationalist marker, which is why it has always become now the most significant engine of transnationality. And you can see that around Palestine. And it becomes the most successful issue around politicization. And the other thing that I think liberalism tries to do is depoliticize everything. Say that, for example, viability is based on making these kind of algorithmic decisions with no particular value, simply some kind of cost-benefit analysis. But that's not how you can squeeze politics out of that. And if you really want to talk about the secularity of the state, the liberal state, then how do you explain cow lynchings in a modern liberal state, the largest democracy in the world? And this is not a problem. The largest democracy in the world has this phenomenon. The United States had Jim Crow and lived with Jim Crow, and it was a liberal society. So I think the issue really is this, that I think Muslimness right now points to something that exceeds the grasp of the nation state. And now whether that happens or doesn't happen, it's an ongoing thing, but at least it points to the fact that it is very, very difficult to enclose Muslimness within ethno-nationalism. I know that there are some mosques in the UK, one or two actually, who say that only an Indian Muslim can be a member of the committee, the organizing committee, which of course means that the Prophet himself would not be a member of the organizing mosque committee itself, if it really came down. But in general, when most Muslims are confronted with this, they recognize the transnationality of Muslimness, I would argue. They still do. That's why Palestine circulates in that way. So I think the viability doesn't really mean anything here.
Okay, I will ask the same question to Dr. Doha, but I will add some the local aspects to it. So another word that I can add to this to liberalism and secularism is communalism. So the prism through which the idea of 1947 has been critiqued in Bangladesh is that, okay, it was a communal project, and that is why ultimately it failed. So that is one aspect. But I will also, from Dr. Doha, want to hear that from the point of view of the liberal and the seculars, and also many like committed Muslims, I would say, they don't see the enough the political, how would I say, the strength or the capacity or the skills, and that is kind of a serious question that Islamism or any kind of Muslim political project tends to fail in one way or another. We can blame the army, and we can blame in the Pakistani context. We can blame also army in the Egyptian context. So the blame at the end goes to the Islamic parties or whatever like that. Okay, they are not capable to deal with the complexity of the society. They are creating a division in the society. So I'm not sharing my opinion here. I'm just sharing the tension, the kind of concerns that are kind of dominant in the public discourse. So yeah, your response to that.
This is such a detailed and broad question, and I feel like Shirley and Dr. Saeed have already answered most of it. I do want to say, at the risk of sounding too focused on Bangladesh and not, I guess, broad enough, that after the Hasina regime was dismantled, we do have to understand that the Hasina regime was an extension, it was an outpost of the Indian regime in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh or East Pakistan, the conspiracy against Pakistan started in the 70s. So, and I'm not saying anything against the will of the people and the crisis that happened within the West Pakistani leadership in 70s, etc. But Bangladesh as a state formed because the Pakistan project was severely wounded by Indian aggression. And basically, after the Hasina regime is gone, we have a situation in which there are different domains of power. There is the question of Hasina's remaining apparatus still functioning within the country. We just have an interim government, which is a very volatile situation. We don't know, actually. The fact that I'm speaking this way, we don't know what the exact future holds when an actual constitutionally grounded government comes back and what it would mean for the struggle, right? Toha, you also know this. So So I do want to be very, very practical. For example, without this is going to sound like I'm going to sound like a vulgar political scientist right now, which is that, for example, something like a defense strategy. How can Bangladesh survive Indian aggression around our borders with a proper defense strategy, which requires engagement and negotiations with Pakistan? So even though the Pakistani military has all of these problems, is corruption, et cetera, I mean, for example, the biggest response to American aggression, 30 years of war on terror, Taliban fought back against it. No matter what you think about the Taliban, is whatever, but the fact they didn't do it with bow and arrow. Something, somewhere, someone supported something. Okay, so these things are not philosophical. These things are. So I'm again, I'm really sorry to sound like a security guy, but basically this is really important. I am very concerned when in the academy, the ummah is only thought through as just a moral space. I'm very concerned about that, about our own ability to defend ourselves. I believe in Muslimness being defended concretely, not as a idea. I don't think defense is an idea. I think you need ability to defend yourself. And so, the recent event, the tragic event of the plane, of the Bangladeshi, whatever, they were trying to fly the plane and the plane fell into the school, and the tragic incident. The Bangladeshi nationalists have such false confidence. The fact that they have these machinery and weapons from who knows from when, and they think they can actually assert some level of sovereignty and independence when we have the most violent borders region with India. The India-Bangladesh border is the most violent border we have. So, the will of the people, the will of those who stood up and called themselves that we are the enemy that you've been dominating for so long, we're the Rajak are going to come back and say all of that is fine. But how are you going to construct a state? How are we going to have a constitution in which Allah is declared as the only sovereign? A constitution that delimits secular constitutional aspirations and asserts Islam? How can you have a defense strategy? How can you have intelligence so you can counter Indian domination? These are very, very critically important questions for us. And I really apologize, Toha, for being so kind of vulgar in a way about almost like a Schmittian notion. But I do find the naive dodging of the Smithian question, of the friend-enemy distinction, to be a disservice to our political will. And Islam is not simply a moral space. The Ummah is not simply an idea of some kind of communitarianism a priori given, and it can just be understood because we have various kinds of exchange of ideas. It is a real, concrete problem that the West actually understands this problem very well, like Dr. Salman Saeed and Shirley Tharine have said, which is that the idea of this is the essential enemy of the West. Let me put it very clearly. Islam is considered like the essential enemy. It's not one kind of enemy, it's the main enemy. So anyone who wants to be Muslim-like is going to be not just Muslim. Anyone who is an enemy or becoming Muslim-like is a problem. So these are the things we have to be very, very serious about. And for us, as we are in the beginning stage, I feel like the great achievement of July uprising was the ability to interrogate these questions as if we have this amazing blessing from Allah that we can actually almost start with a blank slate, or at least have these conversations and be like, we're not going to be okay with this idea of good secularism. Secularism, secular modernity is the most violent component of human history. No, all the religions in the world combined did not commit the kinds of violence that secularism did in the last 500 or so years. So this is something that we have to be but the question then is, if we understand how states are formed, it's an ability to also organize violence. So you're not going to have a choice between repression and no repression. The question is going to be, what power will distribute violence? And what power will organize against such a violence, right? Unless we believe in an extremely infinitely passive suffering as a form of life, it's clear that Islam does not promote that. In that case, the question is, what kind of vehicle do you have as a counter-violence to the fundamental violence of modernity? And this is the question we need. I mean, we know from the recent few days of war between Pakistan and India that India was very embarrassed. Very important point to remember. Why did that happen? If Pakistan did not have nuclear power, what would have happened to the people? Now, I'm not saying, again, I'm not promoting things. You see my point, Toha. These are concrete. These are concrete questions of Muslim self-interest, of Islamic will being protected. And that's where I think, and my thing, for that question at least, because I wanted to add a concrete dimension to the conversation, inshallah.
Thank you. So with that, we can end our the question set, like the main part of the panel discussion, and now we will move to the question answer session. But as Dr. Tarin may leave anytime, so I will pose the first question to him.
I'll be here 5 minutes. Yeah.
You'll be available. Okay. So in any ways, I can ask how do you place Khaza Salimullah's East Bengal and Assam Provincial Education Conference 1906 in Shahbag with regards to 1947 Azadi? So this is more related to the East Bengal. I'm not sure how much you are familiar, but yeah.
So, Toa, with your permission, I'll actually address another question by Hussein, who's asking me to talk about Sharjeel Imam, which I think is a very important actor as well in this. And to the first question, I'll be very honest, I don't know much about that question. So when one doesn't know something, one should say that. I don't know about the first question. But on Sharjeel Imam, I think he's also a very important actor to really mention here and highlight here. And it's very interesting ways in which the liberal secular elite in each of the three main countries we've been talking about, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, share a lot in common, right? In terms of their grand narratives, in terms of how they frame Islam and Muslim actors. And I think the Indian Muslim subject here, and I'm talking here about the contemporary nation state of India, is a very important part of this conversation. What I would say is that, in a world of Asaduddin Owaisi's Be Sharjeel Imam, Sharjeel Imam, there is no question, is currently going through suffering and punishment in this brutal, prison conditions, not only because of Hindu nationalism or the BJP, but also because of a liberal secular Indian project, which does not recognize, which it fails to recognize and is not sympathetic to his attempt precisely to think about the problem of the political through the lens of Islam and Muslimness. That is his original sin in many ways. And he, in some ways, interrupts that kind of a liberal secular disjuncture between this secular India of pluralism and harmony, which only gets disrupted from the early 90s onwards and takes some kind of political form after 2014 with the election of Modi. So Sharjeel Imam, through his discourses and what he's written, really disrupts that narrative. And the article that you're mentioning here that was recently published, I have read it. I won't have the time to go into the details of it, but it again shows a brilliant mind at work. You might disagree with some of his readings, with his understanding of Jinnah, etc., but he has absolutely a brilliant mind at work who does very close and interesting readings, especially of the Urdu poetry tradition. Another, by the way, intellectual tradition which is oftentimes presented through very secular lens, as if there is nothing to do with theology, nothing to do with politics and Islam in Urdu poetry. It's just this pluralistic kind of a Hindustani discourse, right? This whole word is also these days becoming the buzzword, the Hindustan that we have to retrieve from the clutches of Muslim and Hindu nationalism, right? So Sharjeel Imam really questions that through evidence, through analysis, and that's why he's being punished. So, rather than being the kind of Indian Muslim subject that goes out of his or her way in trying to show their loyalty to the Indian project and we're the good kind of Muslims, right? That's the Asaduddin Owaisi model.
Don't want to interrupt you, but I will interrupt you just 1 second. Did you not hear about the end of Islam? That's a joke, but please.
Right. No, exactly, and that's and this applies to all Muslim actors, and even the Western context, who go out of their way and trying to show, no, we really, who will go, who will be all fashionable about wearing kufriyas, but when it comes to the main question of violence and what Tanzir was talking about right now, they would have nothing more to say, and would try to say in political kind of, let's make alliances and not bring up Hamas, let's not bring up the Palestinian, and let's not bring up Intifada. And so on, because it might make people uncomfortable. I mean, even someone like Zoran Mamdani, who's being now really, presented as this great hope, and one should appreciate that he's bringing up Palestine in a way and getting votes and so on. But in a recent interview, he's saying that I won't use the word Intifada because it makes my Jewish voters uncomfortable. I mean, that's the kind of underlying. This is the son of the author who wrote Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. Where do we go from there? I mean, why do Muslims, when they're a minority in places like the US, India, have this urge to play the secular game, to say, no, we are not the kind of bad Muslims. Don't get afraid of us. Don't get too terrified. And Sharjeel Imam does not play that game. And for that, I have immense respect for that. I might disagree with some of his readings. I agree with many of it as well. But he's a careful, young Muslim thinker and mind. And for that, I admire him. So again, in a world of Asaduddin Owaisi's, who's been out of his way trying to show his loyalty to the Indian Nation Project, don't be Indian Muslims like that. Be the Sharjeel Imam. And on that note, I will leave here. Thank you so much, Toha, and really look forward to continue the conversation. Assalamu alaikum to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Jeremy.
So I think we have Professor Dr. Abdullah Al Ahsan with us, and I would like to allow him to speak and comment on our discussion. So if the admins can unmute him.
Assalamu alaikum. Do you hear me?
Walaikum
Yes,
salam.
we can hear you.
Yeah, it was a good discussion, but I had some problem with the terminologies that are being used, as if secularism, Islamism, liberalism reflect the same connotation. Yesterday, in one of the groups here in the Chicago area, posted a question, a comment type question, that the problem today is Hindutva, Pakistaniyat, and Zionism, Trinity. So this is how and I understand the person is very active here, but I think he's coming from Indian background. So when I look at the 47 situation, I'm not sure whether Pakistan would have been created if Congress had been very straightforward and following what we call liberalism today. Congress was not liberal. Congress was Hindutva oriented, but South Hindutva. And that is why Jinnah was forced to demand Pakistan. So that brings me the question of nationalism. We have tried to adjust with the world situation by compromising with the idea of nationalism. And therefore, Pakistan could not have come into existence without defining itself as a nation. But today, what I see is that, someone has written a very good question, raised a good question to, I guess, Dr. Toha most probably, that in Bangladesh, in the in the demonstrations, they have Palestinian flag. Why don't they have Rohingya flag? I think that's a valid question.
It's not really a valid question. The question is valid, but it's quite easy to explain. I think one of the issues always comes out is, why is it the Palestinian flag or not the Kashmiri flag or something like that? And the reason is very straightforward. The way in which the Palestinian conflict or the Palestinian independence has become a signifier of others is to do with the way in which that conflict has been able to circulate. The issue about the Rohingya, when it happened, how many people actually knew what was happening to the Rohingya since 1948? Or to the Burmese Muslims? That is our fault. That is also the fault of our education systems. That is also, we don't know, so how are we expected to know? How many people know what is happening to the Uyghurs? How many people know what is happening to the Kashmiris? So part of the problem has been that the inability, for a variety of logical reasons, to try and translate these things. Part of it is our subjugation to area studies means that we cannot see beyond those boxes. So the reason why the Palestinian flag circulates is because the way in which Palestine's oppression is invested and made possible by the dominant liberal powers. They are directly complicit in it. They are complicit in a way that is not. This is why everyone from the South Africans can see in Palestine a direct continuation of the colonial struggle. You cannot see that with that ease in those other contexts. Because what would you do? No, as far as I know, the European Union and the United States are not necessarily supporting the Burmese regime in the way that they're supporting Tel Aviv. So I think it's important to not to sort of ask these kind of historical questions without actually saying what is at stake here. The reason why I translate is that everyone who's either had direct experience or memory or a family member of colonial racial order carried out by the West can see that continuing in the way that it is doing so in what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank directly. That is it. And our job is to carry out acts of translation which say that this kind of issue is there. This is why the ANC supports, even though the Muslim population of South Africa is 1%, they support the Palestinians because the Palestinians supported them, because they could see the direct linkages. And I think we by ignoring the history of anti-colonialism, by confining it to simply area studies, we do not understand it. How many people now remember this is what is the 1955, the Bandung Conference took place. How was this celebrated or remembered or commemorated?
Actually, I was
So I
going
think
to
these
come
are
to this
important
point.
issues. I think we have to have an awareness of the anti-colonial struggles and a history of the anti-colonial struggles to explain these things. If we do not know the history of the anti-colonial struggles, we do not know our own history. If we do not know our own history, we cannot then condemn others for not making the links that seem obvious to us.
I will also add one point that,
So how can I
like,
after?
yeah, go on.
I just want to add that, my work, I do work on the Rohingya question, and it is very, very, for Bangladeshis who are in the region, in the border region between Chittagong and Burma, the main actors were Islamists who received the Rohingya before the Bangladeshi state even received the Rohingya. And I've written about it, and that's my second book project, which is about not thinking about the Rohingya only as subjects of humanitarianism, but as subjects who travel, as muhajirs, and the Islamists in the border region as the Ansar. So sort of rehistoricization and rethinking of the linkages that we always had. And by the way, the Chittagong madrasas, the Deobandi madrasas, have a long tradition of Rohingya ulama who have been actually trained in the Bangladeshi madrasas and Deobandi madrasas, and then they go back to Burma and preach and then come back. So it's always been a fluid negotiation, ongoing process of leaving Bangladesh, coming back to Bangladesh, going to Burma, and the struggle for the Rohingya people against the Burmese state. Has a lot to do, and I want to be careful about this. So Bangladesh is not blamed for certain things, but the resistance to Burmese oppression has a lot to do with the way Islam has been practiced in the border region between Burma and Bangladesh, both sort of modern day nation states. However, the vehicle through which this communication becomes possible is the vehicle of Islam. And that is actually recorded, that is understood, it has been studied. Unfortunately, most of the Rohingya by the ethnographers have only studied it as a humanitarian crisis. It's not a humanitarian crisis. It's a political, logical outcome of a modern state violating the rights of a people who wanted a different kind of orientation, political orientation, which is Islam. And the Rohingya themselves, the older ulama, have said that because we have failed in our jihad against oppression, we're having to be facing this machine of violence from the Burmese state. So these are things that, as I would encourage the researchers who are studying the Rohingya issue to leave the basic analysis of humanitarianism and really try to understand the political aspiration of the Rohingya people who have an Islamic aspiration, which should not be negated in the discourse. And so it's not about flags only. It's about the fact that the Rohingyas do not have a flag. The fact that secularism forces the Rohingya to not have a flag. The fact that secularism forces us to not recognize. The worrisome matter is, if there was something, would the public even recognize the flag? This is the bigger problem. So exactly what Dr. Said has mentioned, but I wanted to just make sure that the commenter understands the kinds of work that Islamists have engaged in from day one of the very notion of the understanding of the muhajir coming across and attending to them as if they were attending in the classical Islamic time when the Prophet ﷺ and them had to move places and go as muhajir in the traveling, the ethical journey. They're not travelers who are just simply refugees. They're dignified peoples who are traveling because they want to leave persecution as a religious obligation to leave, and they're going to fight back when they're able to again. This is a very important understanding, the sensibility of movement. Islam is not just like a political calculation. It's a mode of being in the world. A kind of sensibility develops, a certain kinds of orientation. These are important things that we have to understand when we're thinking about any context of violence in which Muslims are finding themselves in situations of struggle. And whether it is the Palestine, whether it's the Rohingya. Sorry to say so many things, but Doha, that's my comment.
I was just going to add this point that so the paradigm behind that kind of questions often is that Muslims in the non-Arab world care so much only about the Arabs that they don't care about themselves or the other ethnicities. And I can ask people like, how many of us really know what is going on in Sudan, the massacres? So it is not about the Arab and the non-Arab. I think there are other things going on behind the scenes. So, but yeah, Dr. Afan.
Yes, I was going to mention about issue that Dr. Salman had mentioned about Kemalism. And I think Kemalism, even though we see that Kemalism more or less has been defeated, I don't think that Kemalism has been defeated. It is back, not only back, I think it is dominating in the form of nationalism. And I agree with Dr. Salman that no struggle today you can understand if you don't understand colonial history. But the common factor is that it is Islam everywhere which resisted colonial aggression. And that is what makes, if we call it Islamism, I don't want to use the term, but it is Islamic idea. When Jinnah presented, Iqbal presented the idea, Jinnah supported it, and Pakistan came into existence. It is basically the Islamic thrust that demands that nobody bows down except in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the idea that is being dominating in all the struggles. But here I would say that it is the failure of those who came in the name of Islam. Look at the situation in Pakistan since 1947. It took 9 years, and Sayyid Maududi worked so hard to get the constitution written saying that Islamic Republic. And after the constitution was adopted, he is reported to have said that shukr hai, humne kalma padh li. But this shukr hai did not serve the purpose. Constitution did not survive more than 2 years. And then in 1962, when Ayub Khan came up with the new constitution, Sayyid Maududi, instead of demanding the restoration of 1950s constitution, for which he fought so much, he subscribed to the political process under 62 Constitution. These are our failures. After Pakistan came into existence, Islamic Jamiat Talaba was all over Pakistani campuses. Have we been able to produce manpower? We should ask these questions. So we should analyze our failure. And I don't think that we have adjusted with the idea of nationalism. Nationalism, Arnold Toynbee never liked the idea of nationalism, but he accepted it as a reality, political reality. Today, we have the opportunity to challenge nationalism. I don't think that we can go forward without a good understanding of our current situation. And the current situation is that everywhere you see injustice, it is Islam that is coming forward to challenge the zulm. So I think if we focus our discussions along those lines, it will be helpful. Thank you. So I think you are mute. Yeah.
I was muted. Thank you, Professor Hassan. And both of you can comment over the discussion, but I will just read the questions to Dr. Doha. Can you read the questions? Like, can you see the questions, Dr. Doha, on the chat? Okay, I can read it anyways. So as far as I know that you are a great admirer of Talal Asad, what's your take on Talal Asad's position that the idea of a modern Islamic state is an oxymoron, as modern states' inherent sovereignty is contradictory to God's sovereignty? You know that this position of Talal is flexed by some good seculars in Bangladesh to dissuade Islamists from their ideological position. So that is one question, and you have, I think, a couple of others as well. Another is on Bangladeshi nationalism has been seen as a kind of replacement for Bengali nationalism. So how do you evaluate Bangladeshi nationalism as a possibility of embodying Islamic ideas as opposed to secular nationalism? That is second. I think you can address these two questions. Then we will go to Dr. Salman Said. You are muted.
Sorry about that. Shihan's question is important, but it is Shihan knows this very well, that the good secularists are constantly and intentionally misreading Assad to promote the idea of the secular republic and to basically discipline Islamism. And they're interested in Muslim subjects, in quotations, trying to assert a secular state, because the basic idea, they want to say that, oh, Halak says it's not compatible, so Islamism is out, so basically you need this state, and that's what you're going to have to do. And the same thing they do with Talal's critique of his father's use of modern reason or reliance on modern reason. The reason why Talal did that is because Talal wanted to understand the faith of the common Muslims who, like the old women of Nishapur, basically. That was the whole point, that he's interested in Islam as a disposition, as a sensibility, etc., which doesn't mean that he's not looking at Islamism seriously, his entire work. And my question to them is, Talal has an entire book with a genealogical assessment and critique of secularism. They're always picking and choosing what argument they want to come up with to misread and selectively read him and to reduce him to simply say that, oh, he's not for, he's questioning modern power. He's being Foucauldian and questioning modern power. He's doing a genealogical analysis of how modern power works. And that is, of course, very important work. And we can keep the Assadian critique of liberal secularism and secularism specifically. And we can then think of, and Talal talks about Islamism as, and Talal makes it very clear that nationalism and secularism are fundamentally connected, but Islam is a different project. So I take inspiration from that type of orientation to think about our questions within the context of Bangladesh. For us, the constitutional question, complete faith in the Allah Rupurpurno Vishwas, right? The idea of having God's sovereignty in there is extremely critical for us. So those are things we have to think about, and I think this entire conversation from the beginning to the end was about the experimenting and the creative dimension and the aspirational dimension of Pakistan and 47 and what that means for us in Bangladesh today. So that's how I would deal with that. And I think you cannot selectively read Talal to just apply it in the way you want. And Talal is extremely critical of having any kind of faith in secular normative tradition. And he's looking at the genealogy of power and how it emerges. And we could also look at Gil Anijar's work, where he's looking at the way Christianity informs the secular, and Western Christianity has a very particular way that it looks at sovereignty. So that's one. I think the other question about Bangladeshi nationalism and so on, I think that's an important question, which is, I don't know if Dr. Salman Saeed is aware of the tension between Bengali nationalism and Bangladeshi nationalism and so on. But the main point is, in 75, when Zia came, he allowed for a reconciliation in which those who were considered collaborators, Jamaat Islami and so on, were allowed to come back to political participation. It is the most important moment after 71 for the revival of the possibility of Islamist politics in Bangladesh and to have that kind of orientation. So 75 to us, without being a nationalist, is a critically important point. If July is anything, it is extremely important to understand it as the reimagining and the possibility of thinking about 75 and 47 and how to think about those questions in which vulgar secularism was questioned and new imagination became possible, and the idea of sovereignty contested again by thinking about God's sovereignty and creating an obstacle for the smooth sort of operation of secular power. And I think in that sense, 75 is very, very important. We need to have an understanding of reconciliation in a way in which Islam is not disciplined to have. So, by the way, so the good secularists, what they do, and this is similar to what Sher Ali was saying earlier, there is a way in which Islamists can be excluded, which we know about, from the questions of power, but there is a way in which Muslims and sometimes Islamists can be included to control them. So the way secularism works is it also works through inclusion. I don't want to just be included. I want to question the transcendental mediation of secularism. And so this is the issue. I'm not just happy with inclusion in which I have to now cultivate and discipline my Islam so I'm acceptable and legible to secularism. And this is, I think, not just about me. By me, I mean metaphorically, that Islamists do not want to simply be, many Islamists do not, the ones who do not suffer from an inferiority complex, who don't have self-hate, they don't have this problem of just trying to be included. I don't want just to be included in a liberal secular state. I want to understand how power works and how Islam has a very serious thing to say about the question of sovereignty and power.
We will end with the last question to Dr. Salman Saeed. And if you also want to comment on Professor Ahsan's discussion. So it's an open question actually for everyone. How much of symbolic importance does Pir Ghulam Sarwar Hussaini hold in West Pakistan demographics? So if you're willing to answer that, or you can also comment on Professor Ahsan's.
I think I'd rather answer a more broader question because I think the discussion is coming to a halt now. So I think it's worth just reflecting on Azadi in 1947. I think it's already been said, and I agree that Professor Seni accepts that we are in a situation where the anti-colonial struggles have been erased from the memory of our records. And what that means is that we're left with very kind of local iterations. When the anti-colonial struggles were actually most successful, they were actually transnational. And they recognized that colonialism was also a form of racism. This is why the anti-racist struggle and the anti-colonial struggles was unified. And you can see this through various markers. Why did so many of the people from the Black Panthers go to Algeria, etc., etc.? Okay. And this is why, the history of the intellectuals and writers and people generally throughout the world, the what we will now call the global South, took rejoice in the 1905 victory of Japan over Russia. They understood those moments because they understood a colonial frontier. The challenge for us now is that that notion of the anti-colonial has simply become dissipated and erased, or boxed into small little things which doesn't recognize how the anti-colonial works. And the thing that I would say to you is this: ultimately, despite all its disappointments of 1947, but I would broaden that to nearly every single post-colonial or ex-colonial or post-independence society in the 1960s would say they were disappointed because what was achieved wasn't what they were promised. I don't know of any significant political movement in any of the colonized countries which is demanding recolonization. So despite all of that, they still think they'd rather make their own mistakes than be ruled by others. And I think that's really, really important. One of the issues that we often forget when we make this kind of calculation, that how the Muslims have been their own responsible for their own failings, is that we take a notion of Muslim, which is very static, and we confuse it with the notion of Muslim as a political agent. I would say to you that with the Pakistan movement, you had the creation for the first time in this world since the 1920s, I would argue, a sustained articulation of a Muslim political subjectivity, which was then eroded and occupied by Kemalism for a variety of reasons. And what you see in these moments of resistance is these kinds of eruptions of Muslim political subjectivity. So when you say, well, the Muslims did this, I would ask you, how is it that you're determining their Muslims did this? Most of the kind of violence that has been committed, I have no ability to doubt whether these people pray 5 times a day, or that's not really what I'm going on. But to what extent are they involved in a project of working for the autonomy of Muslimness? Is this a political project, or are they Muslims simply in the way that they've grown up Muslim? And because we confuse the two, we then say that we've tried it and it doesn't work. And the question that comes in, as you mentioned before, that, all Islamism has failed. All projects of Muslimness have failed. But if you look at it, everything has always failed. There is, there's an old adage that all political careers end in failure. Why is it that the failure of the Hasina regime is not seen as a failure of secularism? Why is it that the failure of Saddam Hussein is not seen as a failure of secularism? Why is it the failure of the Ba'ath in Syria and Iraq is not seen as a failure? Why is it that we talk about Egypt because El-Sisi is praised apparently 5 times a day, but commits more violence on Muslimness than anything since the British? But when I say anything but the British, people forget the violence the British committed in the short time that they ruled over Egypt. So one of the things that we can do as educators, as people who are involved in these things, is broaden this diet of examples by which we understand the world. And that means broadening the diet of examples by which we understand the anti-colonial elements and what comes with them. And we see how Islamism has become at this moment, at its most critical, it is an anti-colonial project. At its most accommodating and at its most negligible, it becomes something else. But this is not a fault of a specific Islamism. It is basically how politics works. In a sense that we are all human. If we were not, we wouldn't be in these difficulties. There are many failures that come along the way. There are many things that we mistake, and there are many things that we do badly. The question is, in which direction are we trying to do? What direction are we moving, and what are we trying to do? So for that reason, I would say to you, the July uprising, and I agree with Tanzim, I think the word revolution gets used too much on this scene, opens up a possibility where certain configurations of what it means to be Bangladesh becomes thinkable again. I think the question you ask of security isn't a vulgar question, it's actually a fundamental question. In an Indian government which is constitutionally Islamophobic, and whether Modi becomes prime minister again, I do not see, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm open to that rolling back of Islamophobia. Do you really think, how do you protect Bangladesh and maintain its Muslimness? And you can say, well, we can only protect it by erasing its Muslimness. Then what is the rationale for Bangladesh then? And if you put it like that starkly, I'm not sure how many people in Bangladesh will respond to that. So I would say to you, and I think it's just, and this is the final point, because I want to make, and I unfortunately have to leave at this point, is that we should not get too enamored of this present landscape. And here I think we're vulgar political scientists, and I don't mean Dr. Doha at all, because I think he's being ironic in this, but this is where the realist accounts. They take the world as it is for granted. The whole point of politics is to change the world as it's for granted. That's what the political does. And here I would say to you this, we're talking about 1947. I think the way to narrate 1947 is that what was West Pakistan left Pakistan before East Pakistan. And that, I think, is a really critical insight, because what it opens is that the actual problem wasn't with the Pakistani project or the Pakistan project. It was the abandonment by the elites in West Pakistan of that project and that commitment to that project over several decades. In that sense, it seems to me it is not accidental that the July uprising was able to happen in Dhaka, in what is now Bangladesh, and it was able to happen through, and as Dr. Rohan mentioned, through the articulation, through the vector of Muslimness. It is not, because ultimately my understanding and rereading of this would be that perhaps it wasn't that Bangladesh left the Pakistan project, it's West Pakistan left the West Pakistan project. And that, I think, just shows different kinds of possibilities are open in this moment.
That's a nice place to end. And I'm extremely grateful to our panelists and the scholars who have attended this program at a very short notice. I think within just 3-4 days, we have organized everything. But you can watch our discussion on our Facebook page, www.facebook.com/Shansharan. And we have also a YouTube channel. We will upload the video later on our YouTube channel. And I want to also emphasize that we had a kind of similar program titled Muslimistan after the July uprising in October last year. That is also available on our website, www.shansharan.com. With that note, I will end, and I will look forward to have another discussion with all of you. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome.
Well, Islam.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.